Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country, and welcome to this month's Policy Briefing Series, Federal Administrative Update, Checking the Pulse on Immigration Policy. My name is Diana. I'm the Assistant Director for Policy Research and Advocacy. I'm really happy to be presenting on immigration today with you all because this is a policy area that's near and dear to my heart. I've done immigration advocacy work in the Chicagoland community for a number of years now, and so I'm really excited to be presenting on this with you today. But I also work with my supervisor, Terry Lynn Hines, who's the Director for Policy Research and Advocacy, and we comprise our policy and advocacy team here at NASPA. And to give you a little bit of a sense of the issues that we do tend to cover, if you don't already know, there are 5 tenets to our public policy agenda, and these tenets are actually created by membership through our public policy division. So, and this on our particular agenda is lasts from 2017 to 2020. And so today we're going to be focusing on the 4th tenet here, inclusive opportunities for access and success in higher education. And that's where we bucket our immigration policy work. But as I talk about the different issues that we'll be going over today, you'll kind of notice that we really do touch on some of these other areas as well, pertaining to cost of higher ed and student safety and wellness and that kind of a thing. So let's jump right into it. So I first wanted to cover some information on DACA, which for those of you who do not know is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. It was started through an executive action in 2012 through the Obama administration that created certain benefits for eligible youth known at the time and still known as Dreamers. And there are 3.6 million individuals in this country that are undocumented and qualify as Dreamers, originally created around creating a pathway to citizenship for undocumented youth. However, DACA is not inclusive of all 3.6 million individuals. DACA is inclusive at this point. Right now, there are around 600,000 individuals that have DACA status. But that's just to give you a little bit of sense of what DACA is. So it's deferred action for deportation for individuals. It doesn't provide a pathway to citizenship or anything like that. And it only it extends to a very small segment of our undocumented student population. So over the past year, Congress has been trying to find a permanent solution to DACA. And the reason for this is because President Trump announced in 2017 that the DACA program would be expiring. The decision was then met with a number of court injunctions that has kept the program in place temporarily. We are currently looking to the Supreme Court as the Department of Justice has filed what's called a certiorari before judgment on the Ninth Circuit Court injunction to bring a determination of the constitutionality for DACA to be rescinded under review by the Supreme Court. So at this point, it seems like it's likely that this issue will be fast-tracked to the Supreme Court and reviewed there. But right now, it is alive through these temporary preliminary court injunctions, and then Congress has also tried to find a permanent solution to keep the program in place. However, this hasn't been successful. On a number of occasions in February and then in May, the House and then the Senate worked to find an immigration compromise, voted on a number of these bills presented here in this slide, and none of this legislation was able to move forward. A big reason for that is because this has all been tied up in President Trump's platform around providing funding for a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico border. And so the compromise bills that have been created and debated over the past year have had many stringent additions regarding restrictions for legal immigration and funding for the border wall in exchange to keep DACA and provide a pathway to citizenship for undocumented individuals. And none of these compromises have been successful. This conversation has been resurfaced again recently during our current lame duck session that we're in right now, before Congress enters into a new session in 2019, which will be the 116th Congress. And so this conversation has been resurfaced because President Trump has once again brought up that if funding for the border wall cannot be reached, then we might see a government shutdown. And so in order to so the conversation of DACA has been brought up again, but it has been indicated by President Trump in the last few days that he does not intend to take up the issue of DACA in consideration during this lame duck session, even through these conversations around securing border wall funding. So we'll see what happens there. This whole conversation around avoiding a government shutdown is tied to meeting a spending bill deadline, which is December 7th. So that's coming up very soon. So we'll see if anything happens with the conversation around border wall funding. But in terms of DACA, we're not going to see any movement there. In terms of 2019 to 2020, even though our recent midterm elections has resulted in a flip in the House, it is again unlikely for an immigration compromise to be reached through one of these massive reform measures like those that I listed on the previous slide. The issue of DACA itself has bipartisan support. So should Congress move to pass a more narrow piece of legislation specifically pertaining to the continuance of DACA program alone, we might see some movement, but we're unlikely to see movement if it's in the form of a much larger comprehensive immigration reform bill. Further, I just wanted to touch on really briefly that a number of elected officials have indicated motivation to withhold action on immigration reform until 2020 as a political platform to gain votes in the next presidential election. How is this all playing out on our college campuses? DACA recipients are by far contributing members of our economy. This is a picture of Jinkyu Park, who just won the Rhodes Scholarship to continue his studies at the University of Oxford next year, and he is the first DACA recipient to be awarded the Rhodes Scholarship. And I put him on here kind of to symbolize who we're looking at when we're looking at the profile of a DACA recipient. The Cato Institute did an analysis in 2017 finding that the average DACA recipient is 22 years old, is currently employed, and earns an average of $17 an hour, and is also in college, meaning that DACA recipients are working, they're also in school, and once they graduate, that number of $17 an hour increases to a much larger number. So these are individuals who are contributing highly to our economy, and that same analysis estimated that it would cost the economy billions of dollars should DACA recipients no longer be under status, should the program be terminated. So I just want to put it out there that right now it's really important that information dissemination around these issues is really important right now. The Historic Association of Colleges and Universities has an app that you can download on your phone, and I'll include it in the slide deck, the link to it, called the Community Resource Center, that offers resources specifically for individuals who are undocumented or are DACA recipients and their families. So I would encourage you to check that out as a starting place for additional resources on DACA as well. Moving into a topic around visa restrictions. I want to first talk about unlawful presence. and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of the threat to Chinese international students in particular. So in May, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services introduced a new rule around overstay visas. Under this rule, should an individual accrue 180 days of unlawful presence, that individual could be banned from re-entry to the United States for up to 10 years. So since May, so this rule went under a 30-day comment period, and then since May, they revised the rule and issued additional guidance, which provided a little bit of leniency for students who, or visiting scholars, aka FJ and M visa holders, providing that given that those individuals have a renewal app pending upon their visa expiring, that they would not accrue unlawful presence in that case if a renewal app is pending. However, since this guidance has been released and implemented, 4 colleges have filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security and USCIS. And the reason for this is because of a different change in the policy. So even though they made things a little bit more lenient for student visa holders, the current policy as it stands now makes it so that students are given 180 days from the time it is determined that there is a status violation for them to be accruing this unlawful presence. However, before the previous policy had a clause in there where students would not be accruing unlawful presence until they received an actual notification that their visa had expired and that they were now accruing unlawful presence. So the reason why this lawsuit has been filed is because there's a high chance that due to different issues such as a student not reaching the minimum requirement of courses for that quarter or something like that, be in violation of their visa and then be accruing unlawful presence and not even knowing it because they didn't know they were in violation of their visa and they didn't receive any notice that they were accruing that unlawful presence. So we'll see where this lawsuit goes. It was just filed this past October. I also wanted to mention the fixed duration of status. So this past fall, the Department of Homeland Security has also released a notice of upcoming proposed regulations that would create a cap on the authorized stay for F1 visa holders. And the reasoning behind the creation of this proposal would be to provide clarity. So that students can know how long they may lawfully remain in the United States, excuse me, in order to reduce overstay rates for non-immigrant students. However, this notice has not actually been proposed through the Federal Register. It's unlikely to be proposed until September of 2019, according to the fall's registry calendar. And the maximum duration of stay has not been decided. So that whatever this cap is has not been decided as of yet. And it is very likely that this maximum duration of stay proposed rule will be met with extensive pushback through the legal and advocacy communities. Next, I wanted to talk about visa restrictions for Chinese grad students. So since June of this past year, the State Department has been restricting visas for Chinese graduate students in sensitive research fields from 5 years to 1 year. So during the Obama administration, Chinese citizens were allowed to secure 5-year student visas, and now in these fields, they are only allowed to secure 1-year visas. And the reason why this is so important is because our Chinese international student population is by far the largest international student population that we have in this country, as shown by the graph on the screen. And so institutions are kind of trying to come up with creative ways of dealing with this potential issue. The University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana just recently, Inside Higher Ed was just released an article on this, I think today or this week, has paid $424,000 in order to insure itself against a potential drop in tuition revenue from Chinese students. And this is because Chinese students make up 1/5 of the business college's revenue, and it's anticipation of some of these rollbacks to admitting Chinese international students to work in STEM fields, because there's been a lot of this fear-mongering around Chinese students infiltrating as spies, and we don't really know the extent of restrictions that we're likely to see moving forward around this. Last year, or in 2017, Forbes indicated that there has been an international student enrollment drop of 4%. So these policies, these visa restriction policies, are definitely affecting students on the ground and the likelihood for students to want to enroll in our colleges and universities. This is also tied to issues around implicit bias. Academics are coming out with saying that they're trying to figure out how to deal with perceived biases in applying to federal research grants and worrying about the potential backlash of having an Asian-sounding last name and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of uncertainty in the environment right now concerning biases towards international students and kind of what the future will bring with some of these amped up visa restrictions. Finally, I wanted to talk about public charge. And the main thing that I wanted to mention here is kind of why we need to start thinking about public charge in connection with the higher ed community. So public charge is a proposed rule by the Department of Homeland Security that was released to the Federal Register in October of 2018. And it would provide, so it would establish thresholds for the use of public benefits to determine an individual to be deemed a public charge. And if an immigrant is deemed a public charge, they would have limited options to obtain a green card. So thresholds to receive certain public benefits include that of cash assistance, SNAP, which are food stamps, TANF, which is temporary assistance for needy families, Section 8 housing, Section 8 rental assistance, Medicaid, Medicaid Part D, and some of, so this has been deemed by the National Immigration Law Center to affect estimations of up to 26 million people in the United States and their families. The impact that this will have on college campuses is certain, but at this point, it's difficult to tell how pervasive the effect will have. But based on the experience of 1990s immigration and welfare reforms, it's reasonable to expect that the rule will discourage millions of immigrants from accessing much needed public safety benefits. And also, this will extend to U.S. citizen children whose parents may disenroll them from services for fear of immigration consequences. So this is really something that's going to be affecting both students and their families, immigrant and non-immigrant families. And this is currently in a stage where it's receiving public comment. The public comment period for public charge runs until December 10th, I believe. So there is still a time if you are interested in submitting public comments on this. But I think this is one of those things where the impacts are likely to be far-reaching and pervasive, and most heavily on states with a high immigrant population and those with inclusive public benefit policies. But we just don't know exactly all the different ways in which institutions of higher ed will be affected. But certainly, this is a conversation around low-income students and whether or not their needs are going to be met after this rule becomes final. So for more information on public charge in particular, I would encourage you to go check out the National Immigration Law Center and the Migration Policy Institute, as well as, again, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, or HACU, as well. So that does it for my presentation today. I know that this is a lot of information, and a lot of it is kind of dense and in the weeds at times, and it's difficult to predict exactly what we're going to be seeing moving into the 116th Congress, but we do have about 5 minutes here, so I want to open it up to questions if anybody has any questions for me today, or if there's anything that you want me to expand on. So I'm not seeing any questions, and that's perfectly fine. But like I said at the beginning, a copy of the slide deck will be available to attendees, as well as a recording of the webinar will be available on the RPI website. I also want you to encourage your networks to continue to access resources from the Research and Policy Institute at NASPA. We hold these policy briefings on a monthly basis for 30 minutes, and they're always free. So I will give you all 5 minutes back to your day, and please do feel free to reach out to me or Terry with any questions that you might have. Bye, everyone.